Hi, this is Scott Wardlaw, President of Christmas Tree Land Association. Since we cannot gather in person this year for our centennial tree lighting, Christmas Tree Land Association has partnered with Altadena Historical Society and Altadena Libraries to produce this series of videos honoring the fascinating tale of how Christmas Tree Lane came to be and the decades of dedicated volunteers who carry forward this important legacy. Our lights will still be lit this year, so we hope that you will visit and embrace the holiday spirit as we celebrate 100 years of light, the story of Christmas Tree Lane.
Welcome to the Woodbury House. My name is Kathy Hoskins, and I'm the past president of Altadena Historical Society. I've lived here in Altadena since 1950. This home was built by Captain Frederick Woodbury, who was he was a Civil War veteran. He was a farmer from Marshalltown, Iowa. Very prominent family. He had a younger brother, John, who was in charge of the bank that the family owned. Frederick was in charge of their grist mill, and then in addition to that, they had a huge farm, so they're interested in agriculture. Several of their neighbors, including the Banbury family and the Giddings family, had come to this area and found very cheap land. So the Woodbury brothers followed, first Frederick and then John. Frederick came and bought over 900 acres of land between Lake Avenue and the Arroyo, Woodbury, and Altadena Drive. He also was smart enough to buy the water rights from Rubio Canyon and Millard Canyon, so he was set to start into agriculture. That was in 1882. He and his family built the house behind me. It was almost a carbon copy of the home that they'd lived in Marshalltown. It's called either Italian Victorian or American Gothic. It's kind of a combination. It had 7 fireplaces and a huge wraparound porch, so it was very visible. The view must have been spectacular all the way to the ocean. So the people in Pasadena saw it and went, well, maybe we should build up there. One of the improvements they made was putting an access road up to their property, which is now called Santa Rosa. They had lived here through enough storms to know that they needed drainage ditches on either side, and they lined those with rocks from the Arroyo. Enter John, the younger brother, who was the banker and more into real estate development. By the time he got here, he had visited, before he arrived, Italy, and noticed that they had evergreen trees. He wanted to find out about those. He found out they were called DeOdars. And he wrote to the U.S. Agricultural Department and said, could these DeOdars live in Southern California in that climate? And the response was, certainly, it would be wonderful. So he bought a number of seeds, had them sent here to his brother's farm. The brother set up a whole nursing section for these little seeds until they grew to be 2 feet tall, and then they planted them along Santa Rosa, which is their access route. They even built a steep driveway into the Arroyo to bring the stones out at the end of Ventura Avenue. And if you go over there, you notice that that is today the entrance to JPL's East parking lot. So the DeOdars were ordered, they were planted on Santa Rosa. In 1920, as you know, that became Christmas Tree Lane. The property since then, first Fred and his wife, his children had grown, they moved to Pasadena, and a man named Walker that we don't know much about purchased the property. We don't know much that happened until 1894 when Hampton Story purchased this property. Mr. Story had been a developer for Coronado Island and built the Hotel del Coronado. When he came up here, he added a 60-foot ballroom onto this property, and it became the social center for Altadena at the time. Next was Rolf Goddard, who lived here for a while. He had a coffee shop here, which I thought was interesting, and also a temporary sheriff's station while they were before they built the new one. In fact, the next owner, whose name was Otto Heidelberger, sold part of the property to LA County for the new sheriff's station and the fire department. So that's why we see that on this property. One thing that does remain is the Morton Bay Fig that's at the side of the house. It's now part of the parking lot for the fire department and the sheriff's, but it is one of the largest Morton Bay Figs in Southern California, and it has been here since the original property.
Santa Rosa Avenue is one of the most beautiful streets in Altadena, but it wasn't always that way. When Altadena was new, this was just a dirt lane surrounded by scrub brush. Things have changed, but it did remain unpaved for 20 years. In 1884, there was a torrential rain that knocked the sides of the lane out. In fact, very much dirt went away. It wasn't just on this street, but also on Santa Anita and Marengo. They needed to line the ditches, or zanjas, with stone from Arroyo and make sure that this was never washed away again. The trees were planted after that happened and after the stones had been put in place. So there was time for the trees to grow undisturbed and allow their roots to get deep. Once the roots were well established, the trees began to grow about a foot a year. And the trees were watered regularly because on either side of them were the orchards that were planted, the citrus orchards and the vineyards. So they always got watered, and so did the trees. 133 to 150 trees were planted along the lane. I still have not been able to determine the exact amount. However, they were planted from Altadena Drive to Woodbury Road. People began to walk up and down the lane because it was so pretty and the atmosphere was so good, because after all, they do produce oxygen for us. It must have been fun to drive a horse-drawn carriage up and down the lane, as in this photo. When the trees were about 20 years old, they were about 25 feet tall, and word of their beauty spread throughout the Southland. Only 3 trees in that early time had to be replaced. We have found the best trees for the replacement have been less than 3.5 feet tall. That gives them a better chance to get completely established with their roots and grow and thrive the way they should. We found a couple of trees that we had planted in front of the library that were about 12 feet tall, died after 2 years. So it's really important to just start out as a baby. The very best trees for replacement have been the trees that have self-germinated on the lane that we found at cleanup time, and different members of the lane association or the neighbors have made sure that they would grow and thrive. This is one of those trees. One of our Christmas Tree Lane Association men grew this tree. So as you can see, it's already been here for a year. It hasn't started to grow as fast as it's going to, but that's okay. The lane residents, when they move here, need to learn how to take care of the trees. And so Christmas Tree Lane Association has developed a pamphlet to give to them so that they'll know what to do and what not to do, what to plant near them and what not to plant near them. By the way, lawns are a big no-no. The reason for that is because during the summer, there is a soil fungus that occurs naturally here, and it just loves to have damp soil to live in. So if you're watering under the trees quite regularly in the summer, and not deeply but shallowly, that's when we have problems. We have had to replace many trees because of that fungus. This is a total volunteer community effort. Perhaps after COVID, you might want to join us in putting up or taking down the lights. Takes about 20 weekend mornings, so that's about 10 weekends, to put the lights up. We also have to test them before we put them up. And because we take the bulbs out, they have to be put into the lines, tested, and then put up. February is when we start taking the lights down, and it takes a little less time than lights up. But that's not the only thing we do all year. We do lane maintenance. As you can see, we need a little lane maintenance here. The other things that we do on the lane are inspect the wires, test each and every light bulb every year. Again, the maintenance. And I don't know if you can tell, on the ground, you can see some of the needles. Tony Ward spends a lot of time out in the lane gathering these needles up because he knows how important they are for mulch under the trees. So I thank Tony Ward for the years and years of service that he's put in. It's more than 30. And that's not an easy thing, but he loves these trees.
Hello, my name is Pierre Dupuis, and I've been lucky enough to grow up in the Mcnally House, which is behind us here in Altadena, California. My folks purchased this house back in 1955. At the time, it was condemned to be torn down. They were going to put 3 tract homes in this space. But fortunately, my folks got an offer in on it. It fell out of escrow. It was already in escrow. And they purchased the house, and they worked on it for the next 64 or 5 years. Mr. Mcnally was one of the biggest promoters of Altadena that ever lived here. He came here in 1880 from Chicago. He had been born in Northern Ireland. He had worked as an apprentice in a print shop growing up, emigrated to the United States and worked in New York City and eventually in Chicago, and was working at the Tribune when he met a gentleman named Rand, and he and Mr. Rand put together a company which you're probably familiar with the name, the Rand McNally Publishing Company, and they became a very large publishing entity in Chicago. Both of them were millionaires. So he decided to come out to California in about 1880, and so they took a rather arduous trip via, railroad out to San Francisco and then took a steamer down to San Pedro. They ended up in Pasadena. When he arrived in Southern California, he was just amazed by all the things that would grow here and bloom here. He was a big horticulture fan. And so when he arrived here, he saw the slope of Altadena and what could possibly be done up here on the slope with water and such and good land. And he bought 15 acres from the Woodburys and proceeded to build one of the most magnificent homes in Altadena. It lies just on the east side of Santa Rosa, and it basically goes from Mariposa Street, and it went down to about Berry Street in this day and age. It was 15 acres. And before they even broke ground on the house, they brought in water, and he began planting the most lavish gardens anybody had ever seen. So immediately water came here, they started planting. Shortly thereafter, he hired Fred Rohrig, a young and prominent architect in Pasadena, who designed the house behind us here for him. At the time, he paid Mr. Rohrig $15,000 just for the design aspects of the house. And back in the 1880s, $15,000, you could custom build a house and landscape it for that amount of money. So you can see where no expense was spared on this house. It was really a showplace for Altadena. So he brings in Rorig. Rorig designs this beautiful home behind us. At the same time, Mcnally buys property across the street from here, where the Altadena Library now sits, for his good buddy and business friend, Colonel G.G. Green, who was a patent medicine man and also a Chicago resident who was a friend of Mr. Mcnally. And they proceeded to build the house across the street. He hired Fred Rorig, the same architect, to design his home. And the two gentlemen actually shared a gardener because they had a lot of property here. And the gardener was also responsible for making the gas that fired their gas lights in the house. When Andrew Mcnally came to Altadena in about 1880 and first saw this part of California, he really fell in love with it and thought it'd be a great place to build a home, so he went about doing so. When he arrived here, the Woodburys had already established a home here in Altadena, and the DeOdar trees that now line Santa Rosa Street had been planted by Fred Woodbury some years earlier and transplanted all along what was to be the driveway for the Woodbury Mansion. As it turned out, the Woodbury Mansion never got built at the top of Santa Rosa, but it did provide a really nice sort of an entrance or almost a driveway to the Mcnally residence and the Green residence across the street. So it was sort of already a pre-installed, really a nice way to usher you into these two properties. And of course, all these properties face to the south. They enjoy the nice view out to the ocean. Among the early residents here in Altadena, especially right here at this intersection of Mariposa and Santa Rosa Streets, you had Mr. Mcnally, who first built a house here, his good friend Colonel G.G. Green across the street. But then across the street to the north, you had both the Gartz and the Armstrong families, who both were friends of Mcnally as well. Mcnally had 4 children. His daughter was friends with one of their families, and so they ended up building homes right across the street from here. It just led to this whole little community sort of springing forth from the intersection of these trees and Mariposa Street right here. So it's led to a really amazing future.
I'm Jane Brackman. I'm a volunteer at Altadena Historical Society, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the DeOdar House. It has a rich history, including a shady real estate speculator, the Valley Hunt Club, Pasadena Rose Parade, architects Frederick Rorig and Myron Hunt, boarding house, training school, and Altadena's best kept secret, the Theosophical Society. And I don't want to forget that it also has a notable and magnificent lemon gum eucalyptus tree at the front entrance that has been there long before 1930. In 1887, Baird Smith bought this property. He was a real estate speculator in Pasadena. He was somewhat shady. He'd left his wife in San Francisco. We don't know what happened to her or if he ever went back. That was a time you could buy property on the west side of Pasadena and sell it for twice as much the same day on the east side of Pasadena. And this is how he made his money. He built this house in 1887. It was a spectacular and massive shingle-style house designed by Frederick Rorig. I would guess that it was similar somewhat to the Mcnally House and the Green House in the shingle style, and it was transitional. It's said that he and his friends devised the Pasadena Rose Parade right here on this spot. He sold the house a year later, so I don't know if this was just an investment, he was building a house to sell it, or why he sold it, but 1 year later he sold it to the owner of the Chicago Tribune, who was a friend of Andrew Mcnally and Green, and his name was Joseph Medill. The Medill family lived here for 6 years, and then the house burned to the ground. The Chicago Tribune actually owned the property, and at that time it was sold to another publisher from Chicago named Daniel Cameron. He built a much trendier style, mission style house here on the property in the same spot. It was also designed by Rorig. The family, even though the house was meant to be a winter retreat, the family loved it so much that most of them ended up living here. And they participated, as you can imagine, for those 20 years in sort of the ideas of what the lane was going to be. In fact, one child who lived here remembers when they planted the trees, and then she came back 20 years later after she'd grown up to see what the trees looked like. And we have a beautiful photograph of her standing right in the middle of the road. The Karens lived here until 1920, and when they sold the house, the kids had left, the house was too big, and it was sold to somebody who had it remodeled by Myron Hunt in the Beaux art style. And that's the remnants of what you see today. So the mission style part of the house is pretty much absorbed into the Beaux art style. During the Depression, when many of our mansions were turned into multifamily living, or they were torn down, this house also fell into some disrepair. In the Depression, right after the Depression, maybe World War II, the property was rezoned. And sometime after the Depression, the house was repurposed as a sort of apartment. It was a boarding house, and it was called the DeOdar House, and you would see it advertised in the Star News as rooms for rent. In 1946, it was used as a school for medical assistant training and then secretarial training. In 1951, it was purchased by the Theosophical Society. The organization has been headquartered here ever since. The property has changed very little, including the landscape. And one of the most important things about this house that we never really think about is that it's on the original 5-acre land, and this was about the size that all these houses, the properties, were all built on these large sections of land. They were sort of gentleman farmers. And it's very nice to still have it with the original landscaping and the original property.
Well, I'm here to tell you about Colonel Green, his mansion and his carriage house, and about our library building. The original mansion and carriage house were built about 1890 as a summer home for Colonel George Gill Green, who was in fact a colonel. He was a Civil War veteran and a New Jersey millionaire. He lived from 1842 to 1925. The family wealth came originally from Green's own patent medicine business and from publishing almanacs. In the late 1800s, he sold elixirs and potions to the public under such names as Green's August Flower and Dr. Boschi's German Syrup. These were mostly laudanum mixtures, however, and what we would now call opioids. When the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906, the patent medicine business declined rapidly. Anyway, while the Green Mansion is gone now, the carriage house still stands as a private residence, and you can see part of it here behind me, the castle tower here. Some elements of the original gardens apparently are also visible still behind the fence on private property. When the carriage house was a stable, up to 9 horses could stay in there, as well as multiple carriages, so it's quite a big place. The architect for this building and for the Green Mansion was Frederick Rehrig, who also designed the Mcnally House, which is sort of across the street over there. Colonel Green also hired Frederick Rehrig to build the Green Hotel, the Hotel Green in Pasadena, which is now the Castle Green Apartments. Green Street in Pasadena was also named for the Colonel, so his name is still big around here. The Greens and McNallys were both big boosters of Altadena. They were major financiers for the Los Angeles Terminal Railway, which was the first railway that brought passengers from Los Angeles and Pasadena up to Altadena. The right-of-way originally ran a little ways, about a block south of here, on the southern boundary of McNally's and Green's property. There wasn't a lot of people up here then. It was said at times McNally and Green were the only passengers. Colonel Green had his own private rail car. There was apparently a siding down below here where he kept his private car. And we have some pictures of the interior. It's quite luxurious. The famous Mount Lowe Railway used that right-of-way to get passengers to their Lake and Altadena Junction. From there they took the electric train up to Mount Lowe and Echo Mountain. Colonel Green and his family lived here only 13 years. They moved back east in about 1903. But they did love Altadena. They named their youngest child, a daughter, Altadena Green. The original mansion fell into disrepair and was demolished in the early 1960s. This carriage house had already been sold off, though, as a private residence in 1958, so it has survived. In fact, the same family apparently has owned this since 1958 through 3 generations. Green's mansion was torn down, but the community library stands here now. The original Altadena Public Library, the building is still there. It's on Lake Avenue near Mariposa. By 1960, however, it was pretty clear that that building was too small for a community of 40,000 people. So in 1961, the trustees purchased this property, about 2 acres of land here. And in 1963, the community passed a bond issue of $500,000, $500,000, for the construction of a new library building. Construction began soon after, and on August 28, 1967, at a simple ribbon-cutting ceremony here, attended by a large group of Altadenans, the library opened its doors officially to the public. The architect here, though, is also worth mentioning. His name is Boyd Georgi, who was born in 1914 in San Diego. He attended Occidental College and USC, where he received his degree in architecture. Boyd Georgi was a very talented California modernist. Aside from the Altadena Public Library, he designed the current Pasadena High School campus and many other buildings throughout Southern California. He continued practicing architecture until his death in 1999. And that's all I have to tell you about the Greens and their mansion.
Hello, my name is Pam Wright. I'm a volunteer with Altadena Historical Society. And I want to talk to you a little bit about Kate and Adolf Gartz. Adolf Gartz was the son of immigrants, and he married his boss's daughter. Her name was Kate Crane. She inherited the Crane plumbing fortune in Chicago. Now, in 1908, he and Kate came to this property and built a beautiful house with beautiful landscaping. They called it the Cloister. Kate was apparently so fond of the DeOdars that she extended them up the street here. And interestingly, Adolf was serving on the Altadena Improvement Board, and the street was graded and paved during his service there. He also served on the board of the Rubio Canyon Water Board and served there until he died in 1930. We believe that the Gartzes helped fund the lighting for Christmas Tree Lane. Now, while Kate was planning and having the house built, she built several spaces for friends to come and have meaningful discussions at her salons. Kate Crane Gartz was a highly opinionated woman with no problem whatsoever sharing those opinions. She was obviously a woman decades ahead of her time. She was known as a pacifist who enjoyed going to battle. And she did that with her pen as a weapon in letters that she wrote to people who needed her opinion or who had the temerity to disagree with her. A self-described socialist, passionate civil libertarian, and atheist, she regularly fired off letters to the editor of newspapers, among them our local Star News. She wrote to district attorneys, prison wardens, judges, attorney generals, U.S. presidents, Eleanor Roosevelt, and even Louis B. Mayer. A passionate supporter and believer in contraception and the ACLU and labor unions, Kate attended a lot of protests. She even prepared herself in advance in case she were to be arrested. It didn't happen, but she did pay the bail for a lot of her friends. Her own son wrote her once saying, "Mother, please take some time off from muckraking."
She believed in equal opportunity for everyone, economic opportunity, educational opportunity, and she spent considerable money to fund or help fund civic improvements and charitable organizations. Later, Kate funded a clinic for the Scripps home, which is just down the street here. You can still see that building. That was for Gloria, her daughter. In 1929, she made a 6-month journey pretty much around the world. Now think about how arduous that would be in 1929. She went through Asia, India, Europe, Russia, and North America and the South Pacific on a steamship that she took. The rest of the travels were probably on trains. Arduous, but she was determined. During a visit to Rome, she was offered a papal audience. She could meet the Pope. She, I'm sure very graciously, refused because she didn't want to kiss his ring. Now, we talked earlier about the salons that she had. Many famous people came through these pillars. Some of them, Upton Sinclair, King Gillette, the razor blade tycoon, Charlie Chaplin, Bobby Scripps of the philanthropic family, Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr., Albert Einstein, Mary and Gaylord Wilshire, the Boulevard Wilshires. Max Eastman was her friend. He was a notable radical and nudist. Frank Lloyd Wright and his paramour, Aline Barnsdall. And it's rumored that Henry Ford was here too. Kate wrote quite a few books about her experiences. Very interesting, and you can read some of them at the Historical Society. We also have compilations of her letters to many people, so it's well worth a visit. Please come. Kate died in 1949. She is interred in the Mountain View Mausoleum and Cemetery. After her death, her family offered the grounds to the County of Los Angeles as a park, but that offer was not accepted. So instead, the property was donated to the Girl Scouts. And we have just learned that the Scouts created their own patch program to support and honor Altadena, and the image on the badge is of Christmas Tree Lane. Thank you.
Altadena was known nationwide for its car races. No, really, it was. At the time that cars were new, they couldn't go uphill very well. You may ask, how could that be? They do fine on the straightaway. Well, that had everything to do with the carburetor and the location of the fuel tank. Going on a straightaway, the fuel was fine, but going uphill, not so good. Sometimes the cars were designed so that they stopped operating altogether. So that's why we really needed to have a hill climb race. It was a way to have competition, and you know what competition does. It helps to accelerate the speed of invention. Besides, what could be more fun than having a car race? There were many streets that used to be raced uphill in the San Gabriel Valley, but guess what? Our own Santa Rosa Avenue was the best. It was straight uphill, and the grade was 11%, which was more than most. That first race was in 1906. It started here because it needed to be a mile long, and the Christmas Tree Lane is not quite a mile. So here at Dearborn and Los Robles, it would begin. It would go uphill straight for a couple of blocks, but then you came to the big turn. The streets were not paved, so it was very dusty. And then there was a right-hand turn of 60 degrees onto Woodbury. There was a second turn to the left of 85 degrees to go on to Santa Rosa. From there it went straight up the hill to Altadena Drive. The last obstacle were the streetcar tracks on Mariposa Street. The cars going fast would of course hit those tracks and become airborne. When they hit the ground, parts would fly off. Cars always raced for the fastest time. The best time for the first race was 4 minutes and 58 seconds by the Thomas Flyer. It was viewed by 3,000 to 4,000 people. In 1907, the race was won by a Packard. That time was 2 minutes and 57 seconds. Over 5,000 spectators came to see that race. In 1908, the race course start was changed, but it started south of Santa Rosa in an old apricot orchard. No more wild turns. The winner was the Apperson Jackrabbit at 1 minute and 36 seconds. 15,000 people watched that race. In 1909, the Apperson won again, but only by 12 seconds off its record time from the year before. Barney Oldfield was at this meet. In fact, here's a picture of Barney as he is waiting for his turn to race. If you look closely on the photograph, at the left side, look at the man that's on the wooden pole. He has headsets on. His job was to press the key when the car started the race. Because it's so far away and he couldn't see up here, another man would press a key when the car finished the race up at Altadena Drive. Barney came in second, missing first place by 5 seconds. Other very famous people were here for that race. Henry Ford, for one. Drivers came from all over the United States. Burt Dingley, P.J. Burnett, and Ralph Hamlin, just to name a few. All were greeted by the roaring crowd of 20,000 people, but not all of the people were well behaved. There were a number of people that were running dangerously in and out of the trees during the race so that they could pick up parts of the cars that had fallen off. 1910, the uphill race was scheduled again, but due to a conflict with the Automobile Association, it was postponed until March the 19th. And then again, it was postponed till after April the 9th. That time, it was getting close to the other races that are held in Southern California, so they decided to not have it anymore, which I am thankful for, because every year they became a little more dangerous. The crowds were a little more out of control. And besides, they had finished and completed their task, which was to make the cars better uphill climbers. I want to talk to you about Frederick Chaffee Nash. He was a wonderful man that was born in Iowa. His family came from Marshalltown, Iowa, just like the Woodbury brothers, who settled Altadena. Instead of going to Altadena, they went to Pasadena, where they built the first general store. It was a small wooden store, but there was only that one to begin with in Pasadena. He was educated in Pasadena schools, and after graduating college, he went back to the store which was established in 1889 by his father and his uncle. They called it the Nash Brothers Store. He was a very hard worker. His father and his uncle wanted to retire, so they sold their interest in the store to Fred. In 1921, Fred had developed the store to a much larger store, so they, of course, had to move. So they moved to Colorado in Pasadena. He was a great innovator. In fact, he was one of the very first people to imagine off-street parking. Can you imagine going shopping these days and not having a place to park in a parking lot? He made it possible for more shoppers to shop at the same time. Another thing that he did was put pneumatic tubes in so that the clerks could send the business transaction up to the office and back. Another thing is he organized truck deliveries. I think he must have been the first person to do that. He wanted to economize on fuel and time, and people were very, very pleased. He changed the name of the store to C Nash and Company, and it continued to build. He was also very active in community service. In fact, he was one of the founding members of the Pasadena Kiwanis Club, the very same organization that he had asked if for one of their first projects they could light Christmas Tree Lane. That was an overwhelming task, you know. It'd never been done before. So he convinced them that he could do it. And they made him the chair of the committee. He was praised by his competition for being very ethical. One of the managers of another department store said, "He built a climate of business ethics that is made for the friendly competition in the city." But he spent time teaching his employees how important it was to interact positively with their customers. He said, "Treat each customer as an invited guest." He also said, "The character of our store will always be determined by our own attitude toward our customer." In 1928, he moved to Altadena to this beautiful home that they had built for them, he and his wife. And they continued having meetings and gatherings of civic groups, especially Altadena now, because after all, Christmas Tree Lane was his baby. He was an organizer, he was a dreamer, and he was a doer. During World War II, he was in charge of the USO in Pasadena. He was also, during these years and after, president of the Merchants Association, vice president of the Pasadena Chamber of Commerce, a trustee at Pasadena Presbyterian Church, and a member of the board of Rubio Land and Water Company. In 1956, Pasadena withdrew the financial support of Christmas Tree Lane lighting. The residents of Altadena were very concerned. Supervisor Warren Dorn said, "I think you should get everybody together in Altadena for a meeting and figure out what you want to do. Get a committee together. And by the way, I think you should ask Fred Nash to be in charge of that committee." So they did. And because of that committee, and because of the help of all of Altadena, Christmas Tree Lane Association was formed. And I want to tell you about Victor Falcone, one of the former citizens of Altadena. He was born in New Jersey in 1859. He was raised on the East Coast. After college, he went to New York City and joined a large construction firm. And that's where he learned his trade. In 1880s, he went to Chicago. That's where he founded his own firm, the Falcone Construction Company. And there, he built large houses. He also built skyscrapers. One was the Chicago Stock Exchange, and the other one was a building that's still there now, and that is the Congress Hotel. In 1906, he was asked to help out with building a whole city. The United States Steel Corporation wanted to build their main plant, and they decided to build it where Gary, Indiana is today. In fact, that's the city they built. So he built large buildings there, like the factory. He also built the hospital, and he built office buildings, and he built 250 houses to house the workers that are built there. When Victor retired, he and his wife went traveling. One of the places they really fell in love with was Altadena. And in 1920, they bought this beautiful home. This was the Hiram Wadsworth House. They became very active in civic affairs, both in Pasadena and in Altadena. The Altadena Citizens Association is one of the civic groups that he joined. He was very good because he knew what he had done in the past. He knew houses, he knew buildings, but he also knew lights. Mr. Falcone took a great interest in Christmas Tree Lane, and he thought it would sure look nice if we had stars to go across in between the trees. So he decided to design and build the Stars of Bethlehem to go on the lane. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Bethlehem is the city of David. And so, of course, he used the Star of David. And this added a lot to the lane. He even made it right here in his backyard. He was the first to suggest that Altadena get some street lighting for safety issues. So he suggested that to the Altadena Citizens Association. And guess what? He became the chairman. He worked diligently with his committee. And after all, a man who's built a city and has over 30 years of lighting experience really knows what he's talking about. There were a lot of naysayers in Altadena, of course, and they said, we don't want street lights. And he said, it's really important because cars are crashing, people are falling at night, getting hurt. They had many committee meetings. In fact, they decided to look all over the United States for the best lighting for Altadena. Some people said, we want it to be very non-glaring. It can be bright, but not in our eyes. Others said, we don't want this to cost a lot because it's very expensive to light our streets, so it can't cost any more than it currently does. Well, leave it to Victor. He found the perfect bulbs. And he also wanted to make sure that other people understood the top three. So he invited Walter D.R.C. Ryan, the inventor of the light that was chosen as best, to come and talk to the people of Altadena and answer questions. They had done a test case for the top three light bulbs. One of them was on Santa Rosa, and that happened to be the one that we chose. It had to be suspended over the top of Santa Rosa because of the trees, but it was so good that they could have the lights 600 feet apart instead of just 150 like the current light on the main street was. Victor was very conscientious, and he really wanted to make sure that these lights worked well. So after they purchased 267 of the bulbs, he made sure every other night to go walking and make sure that every single one of them was working. That's dedication. One night when he was walking, he ran across a group of unhappy citizens, and he asked, what seems to be the problem? And they said, we don't want these streetlights. We're tired of this. If we wanted streetlights, we would have moved to Pasadena. We want Altadena to be natural and undeveloped. Well, he was pretty good with people, and he realized that he just needed to walk away, so that's what he did. And within a few days, an article came out in the newspaper that said, and I quote, "Realtors agree that not a penny less than $1 million has been added to the value of Altadena properties because of the lights." Suddenly, there was no more complaining. So we credit him with adding beauty to Christmas Tree Lane and also making Altadena a better place to live. I would like to tell you about Frank Byron Nightingale, a true innovator and a former resident of Altadena. He was born December 1885 in New York. He had an early fascination with magic, and it grew and became his passion at an early age. By the time he was 16 years old, he was professionally demonstrating magic. In fact, he went around the world with a vaudeville troupe, and he performed for rich and poor, just wanted to share what he did. His career in vaudeville came to an end, and he began a new career with General Electric, and he did work in China with General Electric. After a while, he transferred to the United States and then to Los Angeles. And he learned a lot about lights. But unfortunately, the Depression came along and he was unemployed again. While he was unemployed, he had this beautiful house up here. He called it Palau. Palau means bird's nest. And doesn't it look like a bird's nest to you? It does to me. He worked with outdoor lighting, something that hadn't been done before. He said outdoor lighting should be mysterious, and it should not be something that people can figure out where the light is coming from very easily. He invited landscape architects, members of different clubs, to come up for a buffet party. While they had the party, he could demonstrate his new skills of the lighting. I know that he also put music to it quite often. Well, this created a big demand for his work. And so, if you look in one of his books that we have at the Historical Society, you will find an A-list of stars from Hollywood, ones you would recognize easily as his clients. He decided too to try something new that had not been done before, and that was get a 35-foot star, 5-pointed, and which he called the Star of Palau. That star was up here on the hill above his house. It got knocked over by wind, it got burned up in a fire, but every time it did, he rebuilt it, and it got better. The first time that he had it lit was in 1928, at the same time that Christmas Tree Lane was lit. It was seen clear to South Pasadena because there weren't very many tall buildings or tall trees. It was quite exciting, and it was the first of its technology that had ever been done. He gave it to us as a gift. Dr. Elkins bought the house, and he refurbished it with tender, loving care. Then he wanted to get to know around the hiking paths around his house. And one day he found some twisted metal bars that were quite long. Those bars, he was wondering, what are they? So he asked around, and he found out those were the remains of the Star of Palau. He was able to put them back together again, and also was able to light the star, so he was able to have that up. But in 2006, there was a 45-mile-an-hour gust of wind, not just one, but sustained, and it blew it down again. Well, in 2019, some of his friends and electrical engineers got together with Boy Scout Troop 1 of Altadena, and they decided to rebuild it. So they made it much stronger, and then they put the lights on it. They used pieces of the old star as anchors so that it wouldn't blow over so easily. And here you see it as it is on the star. Bill Westfall, who is also an Altadena resident, long time, suggested to the doctor that he turned the light on for the star because of the pandemic. And the doctor agreed, and that is why it has been lit now since March, every night, until the pandemic is over, and then during the Christmas season as well. We want to thank you, Dr. Elkins, for your thoughtful and reassuring gift of hope that brightens our lives and brings us joy. I want to talk about the first lighting ceremony. In May of 1920, the Kiwanis Club of Pasadena was founded. One of the founding members was Fred C. Nash, and he is the one that suggested to the Kiwanians that they take this on for one of their first projects. This project really fit nicely into their criteria. First of all, they could do it as a volunteer group. Second, it required a lot of good planning and leadership on their part, and it was something that was believed to be undoable. And thirdly, it would bring positive recognition to the community and also beauty. First, he had to get permission from all of the entities. Altadena neighbors had to be consulted, the county supervisor, and Pasadena City. And they all said, yes, go ahead, it sounds good. So from that stage, he went on to the planning, which he had to get, first of all, the singers from all over the Southland were invited, some in small groups, some to join their very large group. There were bands to be brought in, Pasadena bands, of course. The location of the event, it was decided that it would be right here on this corner so that everybody could see the lights turn on when it happened. And extra streetcars had to be enlisted. That was a time when there weren't that many cars. He also had to get 1,000 chairs for the singers that were being asked to come. They needed to put up a bandstand, a large stage, a screen to project the words onto for the beloved Christmas carols. The entire community of Altadena and Pasadena were involved. There were no strings of lights to put on the trees. Those had to be rented at a cost of $2,300 that first year. They needed toys for the orphans that they were going to invite, hundreds of orphans from the surrounding area that would be brought by the Kiwanians. Those orphans would be transported by Kiwanians, but of course the Kiwanians couldn't stay with them because they had other jobs to do. Therefore, they enlisted the help of the Opportunity Club, an all-women's group that would stay with the orphans the whole time. They also wanted to invite World War I veterans. This was shortly after the war. Everybody needed something joyous to celebrate. And the American Legion had the job of transporting. They brought the veterans that were able to from Lavinia and from the surrounding sanitariums, and they gave them a seat of honor. The program began on Christmas Eve. It was later in the evening. They started the music at 6:30. At 7:30, they turned on the lights. And not all the lights were lit. It was about a quarter of the lights that were lit. So it still was fabulous and beautiful. They loved it. Then everyone sang Christmas carols. I have a quote from William H. Reeves. He was the Pasadena City Commissioner at the time, and it was in the Pasadena Post. He summed up the event very well. The scene of the illumination on Christmas night was indescribably entrancing. I have yet to hear of a visitor who did not go away enthusiastically praising the superb spectacle. The Pasadena Evening Post also let its readers know that The lights would be on for the evenings after until New Year's Day. And that was from 5 to 9 at that time. I want to thank the Kiwanis Club of Pasadena for making this dream a reality. It was a grand way to start your first 100 years of community service. Thank you. For the next 2 decades, the ceremonies went on. Little things were added here and there. People from around the world began to understand that we had something very special here. Cars were asked to only go downhill, and downhill because they could turn off their engines and the pollution wouldn't be so horrible. Sometimes the old cars would go down 4 across. They also asked the drivers to turn their headlights off, and that was so everybody could see the glow of the lights without having glare in their own eyes. Mr. Thomas Hogue, the planter of the trees, was asked to turn the lights on every year until 1940. By 1928, 240,000 people viewed the lights every year. The lane was world famous. By 1923, the lane was lit for 10 days, and the stars of Bethlehem were hung between the trees. 1928 was the year that the Star of Palau was first lit. By 1930, over 6,000 light bulbs were being used on the trees. They're still not all lit, but that was a lot of bulbs. In 1937, the first ever live radio broadcast of Down Christmas Tree Lane, which took about 15 minutes, described to people throughout the U.S. what it was like to be here with the lights on. In May of 1938, Altadena did something very special. They sent a baby DeOdar to Washington, D.C. They wanted to make it very special, and so they had a starlet from the movie Men with Wings to take the baby DeOdar in her cellophane jacket, as it was called, to Washington, D.C. to celebrate the 20th year of the first mail delivered by air. In 1940, there's communication between Charles D. Purley, the Altadena Chamber of Commerce Secretary, and movie star Mary Pickford regarding the location of Christmas Tree Lane. By the way, Mary Pickford was the first female Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade ever in 1933. From 1941 to 1945, the lane was dark. We had blackout conditions, and we wanted to honor those blackout conditions. Otherwise, we would have been a target at Christmas time. There were postcards that came out in the 40s. They featured the stars of Bethlehem. Those are the 6-pointed stars. In 1956, Christmas Tree Lane Association was established to take over all the duties of lighting the lane and funding it too. Community commitment sort of waned from that time until 1966. In 1966, Lenore Denny was asked to start a women's group, because until that time, Christmas Tree Lane Association was an all-male group. What she did was start the Women's Auxiliary. They were to do the fundraising. They put on dinners, and they even started the Candy Cane Carnival at Farnsworth Park that ran for 4 years. They made thousands of dollars, and that's really important because we needed things to be replaced at that time. Note cards were designed at that time for the correspondence that the Women's Auxiliary would have. They became so popular that they were fundraising items as well, showing the Christmas trees and the 1885 planting date. After 5 years, Christmas Tree Lane Association, the men, and the Women's Auxiliary joined, and we've been one group ever since. Outside help is still needed because this is a lot of work. So Local 11 of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers for 19 years helped us with lights up and lights down. They had the equipment and the know-how. The equipment was the basket that was elevated. We don't have that now. We have to do it all by ladders and pulleys. Another tradition started sometime in the late 60s, and that was the singing of jingle bells to bring Santa Claus on to give out the candy canes. Rosa Johnson, Mrs. Altadena, was inspired to do that every year, and I remember her doing that too, until she died. In 1967, all of the trees were lit for the first time, and they added blinking lights. In 1970 was the 50th anniversary of lighting the lane, and of course it was rained out, but have no fear, they did have a littler ceremony in the community room at the library. In 1973, we had the energy crisis, so we could not have energy going to anything just for beauty. The lane was dark that year. In 1978, high winds blew some of the branches down, and we couldn't decorate the whole lane, so we decorated only 2 blocks from Calaveras to Alameda, which is here. In 1982, Altadena Rotary sponsored the event, and they had the Elliott Band and Choir to perform. In 1986, Michael Antonovich became our supervisor, and he began to turn the lights on. In 1990, Christmas Tree Lane became a historical landmark, and this is the plaque that commemorates that. In September, Michael Antonovich unveiled the plaque for all to see, and the ceremony that year was in honor of what Tim Gregory spearheaded to make this a special place. This is the only one that's a living monument. Or at least it was the first one, I don't know, they may have changed that. The amount of people that came at that time for that ceremony was between 3,000 and 5,000 people. In 1995, we had the 75th Jubilee celebration, and that was also a big to-do. So we had about 5,000 at that time too. So from the 2000s now, all the wires had to be replaced. The electrical boxes. So much needed to be done. It was going to be very expensive. Fortunately, Michael Antonovich, our supervisor at the time, found $125,000 that was able to help us to do this. We still thank him for that. In 2001, the ceremony was dedicated for the lives lost in 9/11. In 2009, the Winter Arts and Crafts Festival was added to the evening of celebration. From 2012 to 2019, there was a severe drought. We had to add dry wells. Maybe you can see one we have blocked with stones. So there's about 4 of those per tree. And if we hadn't added those, we would have lost more than 20 trees that year. But fortunately, all the labor was volunteer. Everything we do here is volunteer. And they were able to dig holes and fill them with rocks, so they're called dry wells. And that way the water can get down quickly to the deeper roots. We did lose 3 trees that year. In 2017, that was the first year that all of the lights were LEDs, which saved the lane over $1,000 each year in lighting fees. In 2018 and 19, We had so many people coming to the event, over 7,000. In fact, up to 9,000 was suggested at one of the years. We had to move the bandstand from in front of the library into the intersection in order to accommodate all the people. 2020 is our centennial year, and of course COVID-19 is here, so we cannot celebrate in person. With your help, we can celebrate together for many years to come. Thanks for spending this time with us on Christmas Tree Lane to learn more about it. Enjoy your holidays. And from the Altadena Historical Society, the Altadena Library, and Christmas Tree Lane Association, we wish you happy holidays.